Hey folks, Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to a Watchman Newscast live stream. It is 4 p.m. Eastern time on the dot. We will be with you until 5 p.m. Eastern time, a solid hour here on the newscast. And remember, taking your questions, remember to send in your questions for our Q&A session. We've already got a very active chat going on right now. I'm looking at the side column of my laptop here, and people from all over the world are already writing in, and we will have a very big audience today, I'm sure, as always, but even more so, I think, because of what's happening in the world right now. Russia, Ukraine, obviously, the war there, the prophetic implications. We're going to dig into all of that today. You might be wondering where I am today. I am in Dallas, the Big D. We are filming for TBN a special about the Russia-Ukraine crisis. I actually just interviewed, I think this is a great way to start our live stream today. I just interviewed a pastor from Sweden. He's got a network of churches that is taking in, and he has 80 churches in Ukraine. He has set up 4 refugee camps in the western part of Ukraine where he's taking in Ukrainian refugees fleeing the oncoming Russian assault. At least 100 refugees per night coming to his camps and the churches and the network of churches there in western Ukraine. It's really a heart-wrenching interview. Women, children, the elderly, they're all fleeing what's going on right now. Some 1 million Ukrainians have already fled. And by the time this is all said and done, several million will probably have fled from the violence, many into Western Ukraine, of course, but into other countries in Eastern Europe as well. So it's a mess, to say the least, right now. And we're only on day 7 of this invasion. It has been a bloody affair so far, but we want to broaden out the conversation there to talk, of course, about the consequences, not only for Ukraine, of course, I just touched on that a bit, but for the region, for Eastern Europe, for the United States, for the world, no matter where you live in the world. Africa, Asia, you're with us. Europe, you are with us here on the live stream. Welcome. I see everyone writing in. Philippines, from the Philippines to Europe to Nigeria to Texas. I'm just looking at some of the people who are watching us right now who are writing in and saying hello. Hello to everyone. So we're going to talk about that. And of course, we have to talk about the implications for the Middle East and for Israel. Now, if you've been following us here on the newscast over the past week or so, week and a half, I'd say, you know a few things. You know, number one, that I was just in Israel. I just returned on Saturday night. I've only been home for a few days. Now I'm right back on the road to Dallas for a few days, but I was just in Israel for an incredible Watchman production trip, a week long, over a week, and a great trip. I'm going to break that down a little bit, what exactly I saw, what I heard while I was in Israel. And you also know, if you've been following us over the past 8 days, that we have been very closely monitoring the effects of these Russian actions on Israel. What does it all mean for Israel? What does it mean prophetically? I want to pose this question to you as we start the live stream. Again, we're going for a solid hour here, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. No matter where you are in the world, write in if you can and let us know. Here's the question. Do you believe what's happening with Russia right now? Do you believe, as the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38 and 39, they lay out this Gog-Magog invasion? Do you believe that the hook is being placed in the jaw of Vladimir Putin right now? That's how Ezekiel 38 describes it. This leader from the north who leads a, quote, latter days confederation against Israel. The prophet Ezekiel describes it as God putting a hook in his jaw from the uttermost northern region above Israel, a hook in his jaw that brings him down to the Middle East to lead this confederation of nations, which include Iran, Persia, ancient Iran. Modern day Iran is called Iran, of course, but ancient Iran was called Persia, clearly named in that invasion force as well. Many believe that Turkey is in there, and a confederation of Islamic nations, former Soviet republics. And we see Vladimir Putin right now trying to reshape and rebuild that Soviet empire. So is this the hook in the jaw? And what ultimately is the hook? Could the hook be natural gas? Remember, when you look at Ezekiel 38 and 39, it says the nations of the world, by and large, stand by and they watch this invasion force come against Israel. And they say, why are you doing this? Have you come to take great spoil? That's how the Bible describes it. But the young lions of Tarshish, many believe that's the United States, Great Britain, the merchants of Sheba and Dedan, many think that's Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the Arab Gulf states. They're all standing back and watching this massive force align against Israel, and they're shocked and they're saying, why are you doing this? What is the hook in the jaw? Why have you come down to the mountains of Israel, where, by the way, it doesn't end too well for this invasion force? The Bible is very clear that some 85% of this massive army that comes against Israel perishes on the mountains of Israel, courtesy of the God of Israel, God Almighty. So he directly intervenes into the affairs of man in a way that he hasn't in some 2,000 years. That's what happens with this Gog-Magog war and the outcome of it. And the Almighty God, his power, his glory is manifested. It is visible for the entire world to see. You can't miss what's going to happen there on the mountains of Israel in a day to come. Again, Ezekiel describes it as the latter days. But I think that natural gas factor is one, it's become big, right? Everyone's talking about Europe's reliance on Russian natural gas. Not a good thing. What about Israel stepping into the vacuum there? If Europe's going to say, hey, Russia, we can't rely on you anymore for our natural gas in these cold European winters, where Vladimir Putin, if he wants, can just shut it off and say, okay, then you'll freeze this winter, Europe. What if Europe says this is untenable? We need to look elsewhere for our natural gas. And along comes Israel with these massive natural gas reserves off the coast of Haifa in northern Israel. Does Israel step in and say, hey, Europe, we'll gladly supply you with natural gas? And if Israel does that in a day to come, how does Vladimir Putin react? He would be none too happy about that, I would assume. He's making a great financial gains. He's become, some say, the world's richest man, Vladimir Putin, due in large part to Russia's energy monopoly. They are, exporting energy to the nations of the West, and they're making a very nice profit off it, to say the least, which is propping up that regime by and large and keeping them afloat in many ways, along with, of course, the iron fist of Vladimir Putin. So could that be the hook in the jaw? I'm going to delve into that a bit. I've got a few articles I can really fill you in on, because I've learned a lot about this the past few days. The East Med pipeline coming from Israel to Europe. So the natural gas issue and the energy issue in general is such a big one in this Russia-Ukraine conflict, and in the aftermath of it, it will be even more so, folks, that I thought it would be great to get into the Israel angle here. Remember, the book of Deuteronomy, and you might be saying, Israel, this conflict is unfolding right now in Eastern Europe. Yes, but remember, Israel is literally geographically the center of the world, and the city of Jerusalem, from where I just returned, is the center of the world. It's also the center. That's not a coincidence. That geographical location, Israel, Jerusalem, are the center of God Almighty's plan for this world in these prophetic Bible times that we are living in right now. So it's no surprise that Israel somehow, some way is involved on the periphery of this Russia-Ukraine situation, not only the natural gas factor, but Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett just today, Wednesday, March 2nd, held phone calls with Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And Bennett, over the past few days, has been offering to mediate between Russia and Ukraine. Israel has good relations with both nations, one of the few nations that does have cordial relations with Russia and Ukraine. And Naftali Bennett and the Ukrainian President Zelensky both thought it would be a good idea for Israel to play that mediator role. Again, I said center of the world, Israel, Jerusalem. As the prophetic time clock ticks and ticks and ticks and winds down, you'll see that more and more. Remember the words of Deuteronomy, where God says to Moses that Israel, the people of Israel, will be the head of the nations and not the tail. The head and not the tail. And you wonder why the world is so obsessed with Israel. And the UN, for instance, has just passed resolution after resolution against the nation of Israel, more than any other nation, more than Cuba, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Israel has felt the brunt of UN resolutions more than any nation. Why the obsession with Israel, the absolute obsession with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Hey, folks, there are land disputes throughout the world, territorial disputes. You're seeing one play out in real time right now, Russia, Ukraine. Russia's claiming Ukraine is essentially Russian sovereign territory. They're everywhere. Why is the world fixated and obsessed on the Israel-Palestinian conflict? Because Israel is the center of the world. It's not a coincidence, because if you're touching the land of Israel, you're touching the apple of God's eye. And you will see more and more, I believe, this fixation. But the book of Zechariah is very clear that Jerusalem will become a, quote, cup of trembling for every nation, and that every nation that comes against it will be cut to pieces. So be careful, world. Tread very lightly when you're coming near the land of Israel and God's city, Jerusalem. You know, we talk about Ezekiel 38:39, the hook in the jaw and the reaction. And someone commented right now, I want to just set this straight. The Ezekiel 38:39 war is different. It's in Armageddon. Got to correct you on that. Yes, there is another war of Gog and Magog mentioned in the book of Revelation after the 1,000-year millennial reign, or at the end of that millennial reign of Jesus. But that is not the same as that Ezekiel war. That is two separate wars. Ezekiel 38 and 39 is describing a war that will take place. Is it before the tribulation period? Is it during the tribulation period? That's a great question many have asked. We're not sure, but we know it is going to happen. But that separate war of Gog and Magog, not to get too in the weeds and confuse people, that happens at the end of the 1,000-year millennial reign of Jesus right here on earth. So two separate wars of Gog and Magog. The second one has the same name for some reason. But just to set that straight, because I saw that comment flash up as I glanced over. But let's see real quick. I wanted to say, I want to give everyone a shout out who's watching from around the world. But real quick, here's something to remember when we talk about Ezekiel 38 and 39. The Bible is very clear that the nations of the world, they watch this and they don't intervene to help Israel. They say, why are you doing this? Please, and shouts of desperation. I'm sure there will be UN resolutions even against this latter days confederation that comes against Israel. But I thought of this over the past 2 weeks in particular. Number one, with the response of the West, which was very weak in the beginning. Let's face it. Now Europe has come around in a major way, and even Switzerland is no longer neutral, and Sweden and Finland are talking about joining NATO, and Ukraine wants EU membership, immediate EU membership, and Germany even is arming Ukraine now. This is, I don't say this lightly, folks, ground shaking for Europe to do this, but it took them a while to come around. Months of the Russian military buildup, months of hedging and hemming and hawing, and some of the quotes that came up from European leaders, literally, I'm paraphrasing, but this was the message. How could this happen? They were saying, it's 2022. Nations don't invade other nations anymore. Yes, they do. And according to the Bible, there is more to come. I don't say that to worry you or concern you. Hey, God sits on the throne. Don't let any of this worry you or make you upset. Hey, God sits on the throne. He's in control of events. And you know what? If you have accepted him, accepted Jesus into your heart, you'll have the peace that surpasses all understanding. You don't have to worry. You don't have to worry. But you do need to be aware. You need to be a watchman or a watchwoman on the wall. And if you're watching this right now, I believe that you are among the modern day sons and daughters of Issachar that the book of Chronicles talks about. So know that there's nothing to worry about. But I just thought that was amazing, the reaction by European leaders and diplomats. How could this be happening? They were in awe. They were stunned. They couldn't believe that Russia was invading another nation. We thought this was over. We thought this all ended decades ago. It's 2022. We've got iPhones and we've got social media and we live very comfortably. How could this happen today? Well, it's happening. And again, it will continue to happen. You can see when the Bible says that everyone's crying for peace and safety, it all comes on them like a flood in the times to come. And I'm not trying to be gloom and doom and a doomsayer, but I am being realistic with you. Folks, Jesus is the answer. And if you don't like to hear that, I'm sorry, but I would not be fulfilling the mandate that God has given me to give me a platform talking to thousands of people around the world right now if I didn't share that. So if you're hurting right now, we have a lot of hurting people. I was in Israel last week, saw Holocaust survivors up close who are hungry. People are hurting. People in Ukraine are hurting. Around the world are hurting right now. And I just got to say it. Jesus is the answer. And if you haven't tried Jesus, I encourage you to try him at this time. And again, in the live streams, we have an hour to roll with here, and I have more time to kind of just flow and share my heart a little bit. It's not so kind of regimented, 10 minutes and we're out, boom, quick news update. That's great. And I love doing that every day. But I also love these longer live streams where I get to know you better. You get to know me better. But I got to share the gospel. I feel an urgency about it. I'm not going to beat you over the head with the Bible. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to try and live out my faith and be an ambassador for Christ. If you don't want to hear it, that's okay. I'm not going to beat you over the head with it, but I have a duty to share this because I love everyone watching. You know, I love people and I don't want anyone to go down the wrong road because right now we're in a dark time. People are hurting and it's only going to get more perilous. And if you don't have that anchor of faith, if your life is not built on the rock, it's all going to fall down like a house of cards. And who is the rock? His name is Jesus. And he's the Prince of Peace, and he will give you peace in your heart. I really love these live streams because I can share the gospel as well as share the news. Back to the news for now. Let's get into this natural gas issue. I mentioned I want to quote from some articles that I thought you would find interesting. I found them very interesting, enlightening, and informative. And let's discuss it. Let's discuss it in the Q&A and what you think. And, of course, the hook in the jaw. And hey, do you want to hear about my trip to Israel last week? Now, I did a live stream from Jerusalem last Wednesday night. Amazing backdrop behind me, Jerusalem at night. It doesn't get much better. But would you like to hear comment here? Would you like to hear what I saw and what I heard and what I learned when I was in Israel last week? In TV, we call that a teaser. I think you might want to hear that. But first, let's save that for a few minutes from now. Let's talk about this natural gas issue. And again, keep it coming. Commenting, questions, keep it coming. I see we've got thousands of people watching right now, literally around the world. So this is a lot of fun. Hungary, I see right now. Hello, Hungary. Great to have you with us. Africa, Louisiana, good stuff. And we've got some premium members watching as well. Hey, welcome and thank you for your support. Jerusalem Post titles an article on February 27th, just a few days ago, "Can Israel become Europe's gas supplier?" Listen to this. With Europe realizing, and I'm just looking at my phone, quoting from this very interesting article, with Europe realizing its complete dependency on Russia's gas, and if it played with the right cards, the crisis in Ukraine can be an opportunity for Israel's gas exports to Europe. Let's see here. Europe would do much to find alternative sources to its fuel supply needs. Again, much too reliant on Russia. One of the ways is an alternative pipeline that will bring gas or perhaps electricity from Egypt, Israel, and possibly Saudi Arabia to Europe through Cyprus. This is the East Med Pipeline. That's the name for it. It's a planned project that will directly connect the natural energy resources in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea to Europe. It was drawn up in 2013. The pipeline was supposed to be operational by 2025, but that progress, now brace yourself to be outraged, that progress was halted when the Biden administration withdrew the U.S.'s support of the project back in January. First, the Keystone XL pipeline, now the East Med pipeline, and along the way, dropping sanctions against Russia for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to Germany. We live in a world upside down, folks, where our decision makers seem to have taken a lead from their senses in many cases. I pray for them like I'm mandated to do, don't get me wrong, but we live in a world where evil is called good and good is called evil, as the prophet Isaiah laid out. These are Bible times that you're living in right now. Congratulations. You live in a time, however, when common sense is not so common. Let's read on. This change in policy by the Biden administration was staunchly criticized by various members of Congress. And Biden's announcement said, one, last May, to suspend sanctions on the Russian pipeline is showing a clear preference toward Russia over our allies. And is there an opportunity here with the East Med pipeline for Israel to kind of step up? Okay, Europe, and for Angela Merkel, the former German chancellor, to agree to that Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which makes Germany completely reliant practically on Russian natural gas. Didn't she see this coming down the pike? Did she think Vladimir Putin was a man she could trust? Apparently she could, because now he literally has Germany and much of Europe over a barrel. Russia provides some 40% of Europe's natural gas. What about this East Med pipeline? Now, the Biden administration no longer supports it because of environmental concerns and economic concerns. And they also didn't like that the pipeline didn't have any involvement from Turkey, because we don't want to make Erdogan mad. By the way, we talk about the Ezekiel 38, that God made God confederation, which it seems pretty clear Turkey will be part of that. But Turkey right now kind of at odds with Russia over the Ukraine situation. That's something I'm watching pretty closely right now. It's interesting to see how that plays out. But the East Med pipeline seems like a great opportunity, right? But then the U.S. is trying to put the kibosh on it, so to speak. We've got another piece about it here, if you don't mind me quoting from it. From Politico, not my favorite outlet, but this is an informative piece. The European Union is being squeezed by record high natural gas prices and calling for Russia. This was back in January. The European Union was calling for Russia to boost exports to Europe of natural gas. What a situation Europe found itself in. Europe, which is now the mortal enemy of Russia, just 2 months ago, not even, was begging for Russia to export more gas. Again, folks, there's an opportunity here for someone to step in and fill that void. By the way, we've had the European Union for a few decades now, but this Europe that's marching lockstep right now in every way, and now even saying, the German chancellor said the other day, Olaf Scholz, the new German chancellor, that Germany was going to now put some 2% of its GDP towards defense spending. Thank you. Finally, it's about time, and not have to rely on America anymore. Look, they see the Biden administration, they see weakness, they see chaos and disorganization across the board there, does Europe. And they're finally, it seems, starting to put it all together and saying, maybe we need to be our own first line of defense rather than rely on the United States, which is just a befuddled mess right now at the top, at the leadership level. And I say this as a proud American. I pray for our leadership, as I'm mandated to do, but it's tough to hide my frustration. When you see your nation going in the wrong direction, it's tough to hide that. I want to talk about the State of the Union real quick as well, and what wasn't mentioned last night by Biden. But when you see Europe coming together, here's another question for you. Does that have prophetic implications? Or is it a revived Roman Empire that you see coming together? Will America, as a proud American, I never even want to consider this, will Europe come more to the forefront, and will the US come more alongside Europe? And will Europe, as it becomes more unified, especially in defense, will it need a strong leader, one strong hand, one charismatic, dynamic leader to lead a unified Europe? And could his initials be AC? Tell me what you think in the comments. And I think you know what I mean by AC, but it's a little suspense there. We'll talk about more in the Q&A, I'm sure, but very interesting how things are lining up. I want to finish. I do want to talk about the State of the Union. Sorry to jump around, but there's so much to talk about, but hopefully we're holding your interest here. We've got thousands of people watching, so that's a good sign from around the world. God bless each and every one of you. The East Med pipeline, it's a huge multi-billion-dollar project. It was meant to ship gas offshore from Israel and Egypt through Cyprus and Greece to the EU. Sounds great, right? But the Politico says, by all intents and purposes, it's dead after the U.S. pulled support for it. The problem was the project would exclude Turkey, and we don't want to make Erdogan mad. God forbid. He doesn't mind making the West mad, but apparently the West can't offend him. And of course, the environmental concerns. which is one last thing I have to read to you. I can't resist. Greta Thunberg, does that name ring a bell? Interesting piece from Fox News, then we'll move on, about this pipeline. Author Michael Schellenberger is blasting the climate policies of European and other Western nations. He argues that they empowered Vladimir Putin. He argues that correctly, by the way, as we're laying out. It empowered him to launch the attack against Ukraine because he maintains a command over the continent's energy market. Hello, how did Europe set themselves up to be in this situation? A lack of foresight. Hey, people like to say Noah built the ark before it started raining. And Europe didn't see this coming, apparently. Apparently, they trusted Vladimir Putin. Good old Vlad did not come through on that. How is Vladimir Putin, this author asks, how has he managed to launch an unprovoked full-scale assault on Ukraine? He points to the money line here, as though here's well written, as the West fell into a hypnotic trance about healing its relationship with nature and worshiping a teenager named Greta, Vladimir Putin made his moves. Yes, he did. And now Europe is literally over a barrel. Could Israel step up? It seems like there will be some logistical challenges now, and now the U.S. has pulled support. Is the East Med pipeline still going to be a reality? Is that still going to come to fruition? Could there be a day where Israel still supplies a good deal of natural gas to Europe? We shall see. And when I said AC earlier, obviously that's not AOC. AC, Antichrist, would be the name. That's what AC stood for. But the world seems ready, much of the world, for a charismatic leader to take us out of the madness that we're in right now. And it seems that people, especially ultra-secular Europe, would be all too ready in large segments to embrace the wrong kind of leader. We'll say that. That State of the Union address last night, and Q&A is not far off, by the way. Man, it's muggy down here in Texas, by the way. I'm coming from the East Coast. It's about 77 degrees Fahrenheit here in Texas today. Actually beautiful, but I'm used to it being about 40 degrees Fahrenheit on the East Coast of the U.S. where I live. But that State of the Union last night, did anyone watch that? Did you fall asleep during it like many did? My good friend Joel Rosenberg wrote on his blog at All Israel News, which is a great site, allisrael.com. Check Joel out. He wrote, he's in the States right now from Israel where he lives. And he said, I fell asleep, and it wasn't because of jet lag. It was because of the content of the speech and the man delivering it in a foreign policy sense. And we're talking about foreign policy and the Middle East, of course, a whole lot here on the Watchman Newscast and on our live streams. Folks, picture this: a State of the Union address where the President of the United States, the leader of the free world, at least once was, does not mention Iran, not once. As the nuclear deal is ready to be inked, reportedly in Vienna, does not mention North Korea, even as North Korea is firing off missile after missile over the past month plus. Barely mentions China, nary a mention of China, America's greatest competitor on the world stage. Does not mention Afghanistan, not one peep about the troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. I wonder why. Didn't go too well. And does not even mention Israel, our greatest ally, or standing with Israel, our greatest ally in the Middle East and arguably the world. Where was foreign policy in the State of the Union? He spent a lot of time on Russia at the top, of course. How couldn't he? But this entire State of the Union address was spent on pipe dream, domestic and economic policies that don't work. And no wonder Joel Rosenberg took a little catnap during that. And to watch it, to not see Iran, I said China is the greatest competitor, but to not mention Iran, the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism, a committed ally of Russia, which is driving for a nuclear weapon. How do you not mention that? How do you not mention North Korea? You don't even mention Afghanistan. If the State of the Union is kind of a state of, okay, here's where we're at, you don't even mention Afghanistan, where there's still American citizens, by the way. I don't know how many. There are still some U.S. citizens in Afghanistan as we speak, living under brutal Taliban rule. That was a massive, game-changing historical event back in August 2021 on your watch, Joe Biden, and you don't mention that? tough to watch, to say the least, but hopefully we are not tough to watch here on the Watchman Newscast, and we're so glad you're with us. Send your questions in a few minutes. We are getting to questions. I want to throw something else out there. I'm throwing a bunch of questions out at you today. Many of them are in a prophetic sense. I got a lot of feedback on Monday's newscast. If you missed it, check it out here in our archives. Hey, while you're there, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you get alerts every time a new video is posted. You might say, oh gosh, everyone says that, it's obligatory. Really, if you haven't subscribed, join the team, join the family here. I love having you. And I assume that you're a subscriber. If you're watching a live stream, you're really committed. But if not, hey, give us a subscribe, because in all modesty and humility, I believe that we're bringing some pretty cutting edge news to you and analysis that you're not really hearing anywhere else. A few other places, my dear friend Amir Sarfati, I can't say dear friend, I've only met him once, but he feels like a good friend. We had him on the show recently and he's great. I love Amir's work. Can't recommend Behold Israel to you strongly enough. Behold Israel is a great channel you should check out as well. But hopefully we become dear friends and we get to work together a little bit more in the future. Amir is a great guy doing great work. But other than that, you know, there's a few channels, I guess, out there, but I really hope we're filling a much needed role in these times that we're living in. And again, I say that in all humility, as just an average guy who God is given this platform to speak to you around the world, thousands of you at once. So it's a blessing, and I'll never forget that. I thank God every single day. Another question for you, though. Vladimir Putin, and again, we talked about this on our Monday newscast. There's a lot of people out there, and there's this narrative. You can see it on Twitter and everywhere else in social media. And I have to follow this stuff, but there's a narrative out there that Vladimir Putin is a good guy, that he's been misunderstood, that he's the victim here, that he's a defender of Christianity, a defender of Western civilization, and that he is a good and committed Christian in good standing in the eyes of the Lord your God. Many have said that. And folks, many have not liked to hear me say this, which has really been interesting to watch the feedback. I had some people say, I'm unsubscribing, you're against Vladimir Putin. Wow, think about what you're saying there. Folks, I got to tell you, Jesus says, by their fruits, you will know them. If you're telling me that Vladimir Putin is a committed Christian, how do you explain the actions right now in Ukraine? And I know there'll be this narrative, well, Ukraine that's Russian territory historically, and they were breaking away. No, he is invading a sovereign nation that was at peace with Russia, and were at peace with their neighbors, and he made a unilateral decision to invade, and men, women, and children are being killed. That's number one. That doesn't seem to me as part of just war theory. As a follower of Jesus, do you have a good reason, in a biblical sense, a justifiable reason to go to war? You're taking on Hitler. Absolutely. There are many, many, many instances where, yes, you need to defend yourself, defend your nation. This is not that, what Vladimir Putin is doing. This is a unilateral war of conquest. I don't know how you can argue with that. He's an ex-KGB agent who grew up under that Soviet system, and hey, anyone can change. But he doesn't seem to have changed. And as a matter of fact, he mourns the fall of the Soviet Empire. He called it the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. The collapse of the evil, atheistic Soviet Empire. He thinks that was a bad thing. That's just for starters, folks. The assassinations, the poisonings, the jailings of his political opponents, anyone who opposes him. How can you defend that if you're a follower of Jesus? I'm sorry. And I'm not siding with the mainstream media. My gosh, anything but. You won't find a bigger critic of the MSM and the left than me, and you know that if you watch. But I have to call it how I see it. If he's a committed Christian, what are his fruits? It all boils down to that. Hey, you can say you're a Christian, and he's, he stands with, in a cultural sense, the Orthodox Church in Russia. But does he have that heart relationship with Jesus? I'm not his judge. Only God knows his heart. But I'm looking at the fruits, and I'm not seeing it. And as far as a defender of Western civilization, why would a defender of Christianity, supposed in Western civilization, align himself with Iran, the Iranian regime, and Hezbollah, two of the greatest enemies of Christianity, the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism, the Iranian regime, its most lethal proxy, Hezbollah, Vladimir Putin is openly aligned with them in Syria right now, folks. Wake up. How do you justify that? Iran and Hezbollah are mortal enemies of the West, of Israel, and of the church, of followers of Jesus, notorious persecutors of believers, of Christians. Vladimir Putin is openly and gladly aligned with them. He's also openly and gladly aligned with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And we know what's gone on in that country over the past 11 years, a genocide of massive proportions. He's also dear friends with dictators in Venezuela and Cuba. And lastly, he has a very cozy, increasingly cozy relationship with Xi Jinping of China, who again is one of the world's greatest persecutors of Christians. How do you explain all that and then still look me in the eye with a straight face and tell me Putin's a great Christian and a defender of the Western Christianity? Explain it for me, because I said this on Monday. I got a lot of pushback, which was shocking and frankly disheartening. Where is your discernment as believers? Where's your clarity to back this man? And there was not one convincing argument otherwise. The crux of the arguments seemed to be Putin's bad, but what about Biden? I'm no fan of Joe Biden. Clearly, if you watch me every day, you know that, okay? We're not talking about Joe Biden. We're talking about Vladimir Putin. Russia invaded Ukraine, but what about the U.S. invading Iraq? We can go all day about that, whether it was wise or not. But we're not talking about that. I'm talking about Russia invading Ukraine. I'm talking about Vladimir Putin, and I'm talking about his relationship with Iran. There was no direct response. No one could refute that. Why? I'm asking again, if you're a great defender of Vladimir Putin, he's just misunderstood. He's a great defender of the Christian faith and of the West. Then why is he aligned with the greatest enemies of Christianity in the world today? China and Iran and Hezbollah, for good measure. Why is he aligned with them openly and proudly? Not to mention Erdogan, very increasingly cozy relationship there. But I know Erdogan is a NATO member. That's one I can't count. But let's just count Iran and China and Hezbollah. Why? Can you answer that? If he's this great defender of Christianity, how as a committed follower of Jesus, someone truly living out their faith, could you align yourself with those forces? How could you poison your opponents and murder and assassinate people and jail them because they disagree with you and invade a sovereign nation that wasn't bothering you? You kicked everything off in 2014 by invading Crimea and going into Eastern Ukraine. And we'll have these revisionist historians here. Oh gosh, folks, I could go on about it, but you can sense my exasperation, because for Christians now more than ever, we need to have discernment and clarity. Choose your friends wisely. When it comes to Vladimir Putin, you can tell a lot about a man by the company he keeps. The company he keeps is not good. It is anti-Christian, anti-God. Yes, the Iranian regime in China are anti-God forces. They don't want to prop up and build up the West and defend the Western Christianity. They want to destroy it. And that's who Vladimir Putin is aligned with. Explain it for me, please. How do you justify poisonings of political? Explain it. I'm all ears, but you can sense my exasperation because I'm watching this narrative from even some well-meaning Christians over the past week defending this man. Folks, wake up. Be very careful who you're aligning yourself with. Yes, you say, okay, Putin stands against the left and the ultra-secular left and the mainstream media in the West. He very well may, even though the Soviet Union was a far left, which he came out of, a far left communist dictatorship. So I don't know where he stands ideologically or if he has any ideology other than power and conquest. But be careful who you align yourself with. By your fruits, by their fruits, you will know them. And you can tell a lot about a man by the friends he keeps. Be careful who you support as a follower of Jesus, because folks, it's going to get tougher and tougher, I'm telling you, to justify what Putin is doing right now in Eastern Europe. And if and when a day comes that he moves against Israel, and perhaps he does lead this latter days confederation, this war of Gog and Magog that we mentioned earlier, then how will you defend it? Will you still, you're wrapping yourself in theological and ideological knots, trying to defend a man who doesn't deserve your defense. Sometimes you got to call it like you see it. If you're trying to support Putin just to make the left and the mainstream media mad, that's not a good enough reason. I'm sorry. Two wrongs don't make a right. just some common sense there for you. I'm sad if you, and here we go. I see some of the comments. Well, the West is also not kind to Christians. We can go all day about the West and Joe Biden and the Iraq invasion. We're talking about Vladimir Putin and Russia right now. We're talking about Putin. Don't kind of set up a straw man and change the subject. Well, I know you are, but what am I? But he does it too. No, please specifically answer me right now about Vladimir Putin. Answer the questions that I posed, and then I will respect you much more. Show some intellectual honesty. Instead of deflecting and deflecting and deflecting, answer the question head on, please. And I say that with all due respect. You know, I love everyone watching, and hopefully we have a good amount of good people watching. But hey, got a lot of love for everyone watching in all seriousness. And you can sense my exasperation, because it's one thing for the world to embrace an evil man, but for believers, for people who should know better, who claim to be spirit-filled and biblically grounded, to embrace this guy, be very, very, very careful. Again, two wrongs do not make a right. I understand your fury against the left and the mainstream media in the West, the secularism, the godlessness. I'm on the front line, shoulder to shoulder with you on that issue. But man, when it comes to supporting this guy, who's a tyrant, a conqueror, and a murderer, I got to draw the line. We part ways, my friend, if that's the direction you're going in. So just to get that out there, I just thought it would be interesting to bring that up and see what you think. I'm sure in the Q&A, you'll have some opinions, and people will say, you don't know what you're talking about. It's all the West's fault. And hey, the West is no angel, okay? But especially today with the rampant secularism, like I mentioned, everything else. But man, here we go again. Here goes someone else. Putin's not a good man, but neither are the other world leaders. I get it. But we're not talking about the other world leaders. I'm talking specifically about Vladimir Putin. And you can't answer. People who are defending him, they won't answer. Why is he aligned with the world's greatest anti-Christian persecutors? Okay, we'll move on. But hot button issue, but I thought that it would be good to bring up. And still, I'm looking at the chat here. I just shake my head. The chat, as I'm looking off to the side here, defender. Putin is a tyrant and a thug, but he's against the NWO, the New World Order. So we support anyone who, you know, I guess I just have different standards for who I'm going to get behind. And this is not a guy, this is a guy who's working great evil right now. So, you know what? Someone just wrote, Eric, you're going to wear yourself out trying to explain this to spiritually dead people. I agree. Let's move on. That's a good comment. But hey, I think you sense a little of my frustration here. I talked about it for a few minutes there. I apologize if I rambled on about it, but I guess I just expect more from the body of Christ when I see Christians supporting this. But questions. And someone said, Putin is evil. Let's move on. I agree. Let me get some questions here. And thank you for allowing me to dig into that a little bit. Hopefully I've opened some eyes there and woke some people up who weren't really asking themselves the tough questions about this man that they should have been. Evil is evil. And God is he's a very black and white God. There's not many gray areas with God. Evil is evil. Let's see what we got here. Someone asks, here's a loaded question. Is this the beginning of World War III? Wow. Okay, that's a big one. I would say, how would we describe World War III? Is World War III the Battle of Armageddon that we see in the book of Revelation? That seems like clearly that's the final war on earth before Jesus returns. Is this leading to World War III? I would find it doubtful right now. Are the seeds being laid right now for future conflict, future larger conflicts? Yes. I would put this more in the birth pangs category, the wars and rumors of wars category. That's where I would put this right now. Could this spread? Could this lead to a broader conflict? Yes, it could. And Vladimir Putin is doing some nuclear saber rattling these past few days. So could it expand? Could it become a larger conflict? Yes. Europe certainly does not want to go there. Vladimir Putin right now, a big question is, what is his state of mind right now? Is he in his right mind? Is he in the proper headspace that he needs to be right now as he's wielding a massive nuclear arsenal of some 6,000 nuclear warheads, and he's mounting an invasion, a major invasion of his neighbor? That's an open question. I can't tell you where he is mentally right now. That's a dangerous thing. If a man who is, and I don't know if he's mentally unstable, he's always been cold and calculated. Has he gone off the rails? According to U.S. officials, they believe he very well may have in recent months declined, or actually in the last 2 years during the COVID period, that perhaps he has declined mentally. And if you look at these, have you all seen this? When you look at these meetings he has, he's sitting at the end of this long table, looks like it's about 30 feet long, and whoever he's meeting with is all the way on the other side of the room at the end of this table. And apparently he's very paranoid about COVID-19. And that's the reason for the extreme social distancing from Vladimir Putin. So according to US officials and intelligence officials, he's become more isolated, more withdrawn. He has surrounded himself with yes men, all the classic qualities of a dictator who's been in power for far too long without opposition. And if that's where he is right now, and he's listening to all the wrong voices who agree with his worst impulses, that's a dangerous place to be. Could it lead to World War III? Perhaps. God forbid, I hope not. This is certainly, we don't know where this is going. Ukraine has put up fierce and courageous resistance, clearly, I think much more than Putin anticipated. I think to a degree, he thought Ukraine was going to kind of roll over. That certainly did not happen. God bless the people in Ukraine fighting the good fight and defending their nation. I mean, wow, what courage. And we need to keep them in our prayers. But eventually, does Russia's massive military might win the day? There was a 40-mile-long convoy outside of Kiev. They obviously, Russia, much more well-equipped than Ukraine's army. Does Russia eventually assert its might and throw the whole kitchen sink, so to speak, at Ukraine and prevail in this conflict? And then what? I guess that's a big question. And then what? So we're keeping it very close. Is it World War III? Look, I would say this is a birth pang and a war, in that war and rumor of war category, that is laying the groundwork for larger conflicts to come. That's the best way I can describe it. Brian, one of our commenters, Brian, wanted me to talk about my Israel trip real quick and describe it. It was great. The Israel trip was great. I was extremely busy. I'll just describe this real quick. We'll get back to more questions. But the Russia-Ukraine madness led to some long days. Let's just say that. I was filming late at night Israel time, midnight Israel time, 5 p.m. Eastern time here in the United States. But one of the big takeaways of my Israel trip, and man, we got a lot of great material. Biblical archaeology, which I know everyone loves. I was with our good friend, Danny the Digger Herman. But a lot of national security, surprise, surprise, and global security and geopolitical analysis from current and former Israeli leaders. But here's the one takeaway I want to leave you with, and then we'll move on. I interviewed several Israeli experts, analysts, and again, current and former Israeli officials. And I asked all of them about Russia. And I said, aren't you concerned about Russia? Vladimir Putin, who's now empowered and emboldened, and he's on the march, and he's in Syria at your doorstep. And as we've outlined here in the newscast, Russian officials lately have had some not so kind things to say about Israel's actions in Syria, striking Iran and its allies inside Syria. I said to these Israeli officials, aren't you concerned? Do you trust Vladimir Putin? And I have to say, I was a bit surprised by the answer. I can't say completely surprised, because ever since Russia entered Syria in September 2015, I have posed this question to Israeli experts and decision makers. And I've always been kind of befuddled that they've said, we don't have to worry about it. And nothing to worry about. Russia and Syria, we're not worried about it. Some have, now in fairness, some have said, well, we got to be concerned about this. But by and large, I have to say the majority have said, we're fine. We have a good understanding with Russia, a good relationship. They're not going to stand in our way. They would never turn against us. Benjamin Netanyahu had this understanding with Vladimir Putin. Naftali Bennett, the current prime minister, has this understanding with Vladimir Putin. They have made trip after trip to Russia, at least Netanyahu did. Bennett's been there once. I'm sure he'll go again soon. We don't have to worry. We can trust Russia in Syria. They're going to stand aside and let us do our thing and push Iran and Hezbollah back from the Golan Heights. I would say it's a bit of a short-sighted view, and it's a bit of a blind spot, even, I would say, among some of the Israelis that I've interviewed, where they don't see the peril of a potentially unstable Vladimir Putin who's on the march, who's feeling empowered now, who might say to Israel, if he has success here in Ukraine, and who knows where else he'll go, Moldova, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, God forbid, who might say to Israel, you know what? I don't want you to carry out airstrikes against Syria anymore. We're not going to allow it. Stop now. We're not going to allow it. That's that. What does Israel do? Israel's a sovereign nation that doesn't have to take orders from anyone except God Almighty. But what if Putin says, no, we're going to challenge you, Israel, and challenge you in the skies. We're not going to let you do this to our ally, Iran, and our ally, the Assad regime and Hezbollah, under our noses, right under the noses of the Russian military in Syria. Then what? I don't know about you. I could absolutely 100% see that scenario unfolding, unfortunately. But clearly, that could absolutely happen. And I think it's a blind spot to not see the possibilities that Vladimir Putin could turn hard against Israel in Syria. And there's been rumblings since the summertime. We've documented each and every one of them for you here in the newscast. I want to move on to the next question. But a Russian general back in the summertime, a top military official, blasting Israel over airstrikes in Syria. We had the flyover, the joint patrol, Russian and Syrian fighter jets back in January over the Golan. We had a Russian foreign ministry spokeswoman just last month, same thing, blasting Israel over its airstrikes in Syria, calling it, quote, a crude violation of Syria's sovereignty. And then, of course, we had a massive naval drill 2 weeks ago in the Eastern Mediterranean at Israel's doorstep, a Russian drill, their biggest naval drill there in the region, in the Middle East region, since the Cold War. And again, thousands of Russian troops are on the mountains of Israel as I speak. I add all this up, and I add up what he's doing in Ukraine, and this is a key one, then we move on to questions. Israel, the delicate dance. Israel is, and JB Maps, one of our premium members, says Putin will be furious at any country that tries to supply Europe with fuel. I agree, JB Maps. But the delicate dance Israel's doing right now, where Israel has taken great pains to not criticize Russia publicly for what it's doing in Ukraine, but being pressured by the US and Europe to step up and say more. And yet at the UN General Assembly today, Israel did condemn Russia. Israel, which side are they going to fall on here? Because the only reason Israel, which is a free and democratic nation, has not strongly condemned Russia is not for any love of Vladimir Putin. It's for one reason and one reason only: Syria. Israel is concerned that there has to be some concern, right? Israel is concerned that if they condemn Russia too loudly over Syria, then over Ukraine and what Russia is doing there, then Vladimir Putin will say, okay, you want to oppose me in Ukraine? Well, I'll oppose you in Syria. And we saw an inkling of this last week, and I documented this on last Friday's newscast. Again, check it out in the archives here and give us a subscribe when you do. Russia's deputy ambassador to the UN said last Wednesday that Russia, and it was an adamant statement released by Russia, Russia does not support or recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. We don't support it. That is Syrian territory. The Golan belongs to Bashar al-Assad. That was a statement from the Russian government just 1 week ago today, folks. In that same statement, he talked about the government in Tel Aviv. Not in Jerusalem. Did you catch that? The Israeli government, the seat of government, the ancient and ancestral capital of Israel is Jerusalem. Yet he said the government in Tel Aviv as a slight, as an insult, clearly. Israel is concerned that if it opposes Russia on Ukraine, Russia will oppose Israel on Syria, on the Golan, on Jerusalem. And that's the simple reason. It's a tough spot to be in for Israel, but that's a simple reason that you haven't seen more of a loud Israeli response to the goings on in Russia. You also have some 1 million Russian Jews living in Israel. It's a complex situation, but tinderbox. I see that relationship between Israel and Russia as a bit of a tinderbox. It's a warm relationship on the surface. It's all gone swimmingly the past few years, operating in Syria with a free hand. But I believe that could flip on a dime. And I'm pretty sure most of our viewers believe that too, especially when they read the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, and the war of Gog and Magog. Man, someone asked here, let's get some more questions. We've got a few minutes left. We've got thousands of people with us. We still got time. Let's get some more questions in. Let's see. Let's see what we have. Someone asks if the Golan Heights could be the hook in the jaw to bring Russia down. I talked about the hook in the jaw earlier, perhaps, but what in the Golan? Just Israeli control over the Golan? Does Russia feel that strongly about it, where they would occupy the Golan? Gosh, who knows? Predict the unpredictable, expect the unexpected today. A struggle over the Golan. That's an interesting point, actually. Does Assad now feel emboldened with Russian support and really stake his claim to the Golan even more? By the way, the UN does not recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan either, even though the Golan Heights was sovereign Israeli territory over 2,000 years ago. How do I know that? Not only because various extra biblical sources tell us that, but because I've been in the Golan Heights many times. And I've been inside ancient synagogues dating back over 2,000 years. Jews were in the Golan 2,000 years ago. Know your history. Hey, we've got about 3 minutes here. Wow, here is a question from, Jacob's trouble. Are we in the time of Jacob's trouble? Someone asks. Are we in the 7 years of tribulation right now? No, we are not in the 7-year tribulation right now. We are not in the time of Jacob's trouble, which will be a very difficult time for Israel laid out in the Bible. But we're getting close, unless my discernment's completely off. Here's a popular question we have here again. Psalm 83. And I throw this question back to you. What do you think of Psalm 83? We talk a lot about Isaiah 17, the future of Damascus. It's not a good one. We talk a lot about Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. Psalm 83 is something people bring up a lot as well. And it also talks about a confederation of nations surrounding Israel that come against Israel. The big question is, did it already happen? Some prophecy scholars believe Psalm 83 has yet to happen. Some believe it already happened. Some point to 1948, Israel's war for independence and the nations surrounding it then, as fulfilling Psalm 83. And some point to 1967, the Six-Day War. Someone says here, Flyboy 1960 commenter says Psalm 83 was just a lament. Interesting. I don't have a clear view on Psalm 83. I tend to think it may have already been fulfilled, but I'm open. I've heard definitely many interpretations on it, and I'm open to more, but we will watch and wait. I think Ezekiel 38, 39, the big one, there will be smaller, sad to say, there will be smaller scale wars before Ezekiel 38 and 39 for sure. The Great Northern War we've talked about here with Hezbollah and Iran to the north of Israel, and Hamas, and that ring of fire that surrounds Israel that will have to be dealt with. I believe that will be dealt with separately before the war of Gog and Magog. That's my view. As the war, the birth pangs, I said Russia-Ukraine, birth pang, precursor to larger things to come that won't be too pleasant. But guess what? You've got the anchor in your life, and his name is Jesus. And because you have that anchor, you're going to be able to withstand the storms when the waves are crashing, the winds are roaring, and it looks like you're going to capsize and the world is going to capsize. Jesus is in the boat with you. Never forget it. Take heart. Be encouraged. Just stay in prayer. Love your family. Walk the walk of faith. You will be just fine. Keep looking up. I think that's a good way to end today. From Dallas, thanks so much for joining us here in the newscast. Until tomorrow, God bless you. Stay in prayer. It works. And never hold your peace.
Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the Watchman Newscast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to see more, make sure you go ahead and hit the like button, click subscribe, and tap the bell icon to turn on notifications for new Watchman Newscast episodes every weekday.